Close your eyes, if you wish, and let the sound of this story guide you into another world. Tonight, we will journey deep into the jungles of Central America, where centuries ago, the Maya civilization rose and flourished. You may picture towering, stone pyramids rising above a sea of green, carvings etched into weathered stone, and mysterious glyphs telling stories that still fascinate us today. Yet, behind those monuments lay the lives of countless ordinary people, whose days were filled, not with glory, but with hardship. Together, we will wander slowly through their world, seeing why, despite their brilliance and resilience, life for the ancient Maya was often harsh, demanding, and, in many ways, brutal. If you enjoy these calm explorations of the past, and wish to drift with me again into forgotten worlds, I invite you to stay connected here, where history is told softly, and sleep always has room to arrive. And now, let us begin. The land of the Maya stretched wide across what is today Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. It was a land of contrasts, thick, humid jungles where howler monkeys called from treetops, dry highlands where crops struggled against rocky soil, and lowland plains where rivers meandered lazily but sometimes flooded without warning. The air itself carried a weight, heavy with moisture and filled with the scent of earth, blossoms, and wood smoke from countless small fires. To live in this world was to live with the elements pressing close at all times. For the Maya, daily life began at dawn. As the first light filtered through palm fronds and the mist lifted from the jungle floor, households stirred. Families awoke. On mats woven from reeds, the coolness of night still clinging to their skin before the heat of the day settled in. Homes were modest, built from wood poles plastered with mud, their thatched roofs rustling softly in the breeze. Floors were of packed earth, swept smooth but uneven beneath bare feet. Inside, tools and baskets were carefully stored, while clay pots lined one corner, ready for the day's meals. Breakfast was simple but sustaining. Thick maize gruel, called atole, was ladled into bowls and sipped slowly. The flavor was earthy, comforting, sometimes sweetened with honey if a family was fortunate, or spiced with chili for a sharper taste. Tortillas, pressed by hand and warmed on clay griddles, were a staple, the scent of toasting corn filling the air. Beans, squash, and occasionally fruits like papaya or avocado rounded out the meal. The work of grinding maize was endless. Women knelt over stone grinding slabs called matatas, their arms moving back and forth, pressing heavy stones into kernels until they broke down into flour. The sound of stone against stone was constant, rhythmic, echoing in nearly every Maya home. Once the meal was eaten, the day unfolded into labor. Men often walked to the fields, the milpas, as they were known, where maize, beans, and squash were cultivated together. The system was clever, the crops supporting one another, but the work itself was grueling. In the humid lowlands, sweat began to gather almost as soon as the sun rose. Men cleared brush with stone or obsidian tools, hacked weeds, and bent low to tend the fragile shoots. The soil, though fertile in patches, demanded constant attention, and overuse could quickly exhaust it. To farm here was to battle against the stubbornness of the land itself. Women's labor, though less visible in the fields, was no lighter. Beyond grinding maize and preparing food, they wove cotton into cloth, their looms stretched between posts or trees. The threads, dyed with plants and minerals, formed intricate patterns, their weaving both practical and symbolic. They carried water in clay jars from nearby notes, natural wells that cut into the limestone beneath the earth, or from rivers that flowed sluggishly through the forest. The jars were heavy, the paths uneven, and yet this task repeated day after day, generation after generation. Children, too, bore responsibilities from an early age. Little hands helped gather firewood, carry smaller baskets of maize, or watch over younger siblings. Their laughter sometimes rose above the sounds of work, but play was often woven into labor. For a Maya child, to learn was to imitate, to follow the motions of elders until they became natural. The environment itself was relentless. In the lowlands, the heat pressed down during midday, air thick and stifling. Insects buzzed constantly, biting and stinging, their sound never far from the ear. Rainstorms swept suddenly across the land, turning dirt paths into mud and flooding fields. And yet, in dry seasons, water could vanish, rivers shrinking to trickles, cenotes becoming lifelines. Life for the Maya meant adapting constantly, shifting with the rhythms of nature, never fully in control. But even as life was harsh, it was deeply patterned, ordered by cycles of time that the Maya understood with astonishing precision. Their calendar systems were elaborate, tracking days, months, and years with care. Farmers looked at the sky, noting the rising of certain stars, the movement of the sun, the phases of the moon. Rituals and ceremonies marked the planting and the harvest, asking the gods for rain, for fertility, for protection against pests and drought. To work the land without ritual was unthinkable. Religion, for the Maya, was not a separate part of life, but the very fabric of it. The gods were everywhere, in the rustle of the trees, in the crash of thunder, in the still surface of a sun. Offerings were made daily, often small, a few drops of food, a piece of incense, a whispered prayer. Larger ceremonies punctuated the year, with drums, flutes, and chants rising into the night air. The smell of copal resin burned on altars, its thick, sweet smoke curling into the heavens. Firelight flickered against stone walls, casting shadows of dancers moving in time to the beat of drums. For common families, these rituals were not just duties but comforts. In a life of uncertainty, the gods provided a framework of meaning, a sense that even hardship was part of a greater order. When crops failed, when illness spread, when storms destroyed homes, people sought reassurance in ceremony. Priests, with their knowledge of calendars and glyphs, spoke with authority, guiding the people in how to restore balance. But behind this order lay realities that were often difficult. The elite of Maya society, the rulers, nobles, and priests, lived in ways far removed from the farmers and artisans who sustained them. Palaces rose above city centers, their walls painted in bright colors, their courtyards paved and ornamented. Nobles dined on finer foods, wearing feathers and jade, their lives cushioned by the labor of others. Taxes, in the form of maize, textiles, or labor, flowed upward, drawn from countless households that already lived with little margin. For ordinary Maya, the demands of rulers added another layer of hardship. Families might be called upon to provide extra maize for feasts, or to weave cloth for tribute, or to send sons to help in construction projects. Refusal was not an option. Even as households struggled to meet their own needs, they were expected to contribute to the grandeur of their cities, to ensure that ceremonies continued and rulers were honored. And so, the grandeur of Maya civilization, its temples, its cities, its carved stele and painted murals, was built upon the labor of many whose names have been lost. Their sweat darkened the earth, their backs bent under loads of stone, their arms ached from endless grinding, weaving, and carrying. As night fell over Maya villages, the sounds of the day slowly faded. Fires burned low, sending thin trails of smoke into the dark sky. Crickets and frogs filled the air with their steady chorus. Families lay down once more on woven mats, the earth cool beneath them, the stars visible through gaps in thatched roofs. Dreams mingled with the rhythm of drums in the distance, reminders that tomorrow, once again, would bring the same cycle of toil, devotion, and resilience. And so, as we move slowly deeper into the heart of the Maya world, we begin to leave the small household compounds scattered across the countryside, and instead, we enter the growing centers of stone and plaza, the cities that rose above, the green sea of jungle. The Maya city was unlike the cities of the modern world. It did not sprawl endlessly with stone streets and neat lines of houses. Instead, it spread in clusters, carefully placed, with open courtyards, ceremonial plazas, and towering temples that seemed to grow from the very earth. Around these great stone cores, families built their more humble homes of wood and thatch, forming a living tapestry of high and low, sacred and ordinary. Walking into such a city, the first impression was always one of awe. Imagine, in your mind, rising from the dense foliage, the grey and cream stone of pyramids, their steps climbing skyward. The air echoed with the calls of tropical birds, their wings flashing against the muted tones of stone. From afar, the city seemed timeless, as though it had always been there, waiting. Yet, as one stepped closer, the truth revealed itself. Every block of stone had been hauled by human strength, every carving etched by careful hands, every plaza swept by countless feet. At the heart of these cities were the ceremonial centers, wide plazas bordered by temples and palaces. These open spaces were places of gathering, where the community witnessed rituals, celebrations, and declarations. On certain days, the plazas filled with people carrying baskets of offerings, their clothing bright with woven colors, their faces calm yet expectant. The air grew thick with incense, music, and the low hum of voices. But outside of these days of ceremony, the plazas also served quieter functions. Children might chase one another across the open stone surfaces, their laughter rising above the steady buzz of cicadas. Merchants laid out mats and displayed their goods: clay pots, woven textiles, obsidian blades, dried peppers, and cacao beans, which were not just a drink but also a form of currency. People lingered, exchanging gossip, arranging marriages, or negotiating trades. Life here was a blend of the sacred and the everyday, the monumental and the mundane. The architecture itself reflected the Maya understanding of balance and order. Temples were aligned with the movements of the sun and stars, their steps rising steeply, narrow at the top, as though reaching toward the heavens. Palaces spread low and wide, their rooms cool in the shade, their walls sometimes painted in reds, blues, and yellows that have faded with time but once gleamed vibrantly. Stone stelae stood upright in plazas, tall slabs carved with glyphs and figures. These told the stories of rulers, their victories, their lineages, and their connection to the gods. For the people who passed them daily, they were silent but powerful reminders of authority and tradition. Yet, behind the majesty of stone, life remained demanding. For every grand palace, there were countless homes of humble construction, families huddled together in small huts, their walls woven from sticks and plastered with mud, their roofs thick with palm thatch. Inside, there was little ornament, only what was needed: a market, a few mats, clay vessels, a loom, perhaps a grinding stone. When rains were heavy, mud sometimes seeped inside. When drought came, the air grew unbearably hot beneath the low roofs. Within these cities, the weight of social divisions was felt strongly. Nobles and rulers lived close to the ceremonial heart, their compounds larger, their access to resources greater. Common families clustered on the outskirts, sometimes walking long distances to fetch water or attend the great gatherings. Artisans, skilled in their craft, occupied a place between, respected for their talents, but still required to provide goods and services as tribute. The demands placed upon the people were constant. Large construction projects, temples, ball courts, reservoirs called for thousands of workers. Men were summoned to carry stones, to shape blocks, to haul them up steep inclines under the heat of the sun. Women supported the effort by weaving cloth for laborers, preparing food in immense quantities, and ensuring that offerings were prepared for ceremonies of dedication. These efforts bound the community together, but they also weighed heavily on households already stretched thin. The Maya ball game, a ritual as much as a sport, drew crowds to specially constructed courts. The game was played with a heavy rubber ball, struck with hips, elbows, and knees. The echo of the ball striking stone rings resounded through the court, while onlookers leaned forward, captivated. For common people, these matches were entertainment and communal pride, a chance to watch skill and strength displayed before the gods. But for players, the demands were intense, training their bodies to endure impact, moving with precision in the heat, balancing between play and ritual duty. Markets pulsed with activity on certain days, drawing people from surrounding areas. Imagine the scent of roasted cacao mingling with the sharpness of chili peppers, the earthy aroma of maize dough, and the sweet tang of honey. Traders spread goods before them: carved jade beads, colorful feathers from parrots and quetzals, obsidian blades glinting in the sun, and clay figurines painted with care. Negotiations were quiet but firm, measured in cacao beans and textiles. For many, these markets were lifelines, places where what was lacking at home could be exchanged for what was needed. Yet, even here, disparities showed. Nobles had access to finer goods, rarer feathers, more polished jade, while commoners left with simple necessities, sometimes settling for less than they had hoped. The structure of Maya society left little room for escape from duty. Families owed tribute to rulers, not just in the form of labor, but in food and crafted goods. A household might be required to send woven cloth to a palace, or jars of maize to feed a retinue of warriors or priests. This tribute could weigh heavily, particularly in years when crops struggled. To give up a portion of one's harvest when children were hungry was a bitter reality. Yet it was one that could not be avoided. As dusk fell upon the cities, torches flickered in courtyards, casting shadows against stone walls. The rhythm of the day slowed, but even then, work continued. Women ground maize for the next day, their arms aching from the motion but steady, practiced. Men repaired tools by firelight, sharpening obsidian blades, adjusting handles. Children drifted into sleep, their small bodies curled on mats, their dreams touched by the murmur of voices and the distant beat of a drum. Overhead, the stars shone with extraordinary clarity, undimmed by the absence of artificial light. The Maya looked upward often, their calendars, their rituals, their very sense of existence tied to the heavens. Certain constellations marked the time to plant, others the time to harvest. Eclipses and planetary alignments were noted with care, their meanings woven into ritual and prophecy. For common people, this meant a constant awareness that life's hardships and cycles were part of something larger, written in the stars above. Yet, despite this cosmic order, the demands of daily existence pressed close. Food was never guaranteed, water never certain, and obligations to rulers and gods never ending. To live in a Maya city was to live both in awe of its grandeur and in the shadow of its demands, balancing between pride in community and the quiet exhaustion of survival. And still, families endured. Night after night, they lay down on mats, listening to the rustle of leaves, the crackle of distant fires, and the low hum of insects. The city slumbered around them, stone monuments silent under the stars, while hearts beat steadily with the hope that tomorrow's labor would bring sustenance, order, and the fragile gift of continuity. Religion was the quiet thread that wove through every moment of Maya life, guiding the planting of seeds, the grinding of maize, the setting of stones, and the raising of children. To live in the Maya world was to live in a universe where the sacred and the ordinary were inseparable. Every action carried meaning, every day fit within a cosmic rhythm. The gods were everywhere. They lived in the clouds, in the stars, in the rain, in the trees, in the flicker of firelight. They watched from above, and they listened from within. The Maya believed that the world was layered, like the tiers of a temple. There was the sky, bright and filled with gods of sun, moon, and stars. There was the earth, where people walked, planted, and built. And below was the underworld, a shadowed place not simply of punishment, but of challenge, transformation, and mystery. Each day, from dawn until dusk, rituals echoed this cosmic order. At sunrise, as the light first touched the tops of temple pyramids, incense drifted into the sky. Resin from the copal tree was placed upon glowing coals, sending white smoke curling upward. Its fragrance was sweet, yet sharp, and it carried prayers skyward, linking the human world with the divine. Priests stood solemnly, their robes flowing, their hands lifted toward the horizon, speaking words that aligned the people with the gods. Ordinary households too had their rituals. A woman grinding maize at dawn might sprinkle the first grains upon the ground in quiet thanks. A man planting seeds would pause, pressing his hand into the soil, offering a few whispered words. These small gestures, repeated across the landscape, carried as much meaning as the grand ceremonies of the temples. They reminded every person that survival was not simply labor, but partnership with unseen powers. The gods themselves were many, each with roles both kind and demanding. Chok, the god of rain, held power over harvests, his favor bringing life, his absence bringing drought. The maize god was central, his image found in carvings, painted vessels, and stories passed down through generations. His death and rebirth mirrored the cycle of planting and harvesting, a cycle that defined the lives of all Maya people. The sun god journeyed across the sky each day, plunging into the underworld at night only to rise again, renewing life. To honor these forces, ceremonies were woven into the fabric of time. The Maya calendar, intricate and precise, measured not only the days of the year, but also cycles of ritual. Days were not simply counted, they were alive with meaning. Each carried its own energy, its own weight, shaping what actions were best taken. One day might be suited for planting, another for beginning a journey, another for making offerings. Priests, trained in reading these cycles, guided communities with quiet authority, ensuring that actions were aligned with cosmic balance. Rituals could be grand and elaborate, drawing entire cities into plazas for days of ceremony. Trumpets made from conch shells sounded, their deep tones vibrating through the air. Drums echoed, steady and low, like the heartbeat of the earth. Dancers in feathered headdresses moved slowly, their steps deliberate, their costumes rustling with the sounds of shells, beads, and fabric. The air grew thick with smoke, heavy with anticipation. Rulers appeared, adorned with jade, their voices carrying promises of order, prosperity, and divine connection. Yet, alongside the splendor, there was always sacrifice. The Maya believed that life required exchange, that the gods gave to humans, and humans must give in return. Offerings of food, incense, jade, and feathers were common, placed upon altars with reverence. In moments of great need, in drought, in war, in uncertainty, deeper sacrifices were called upon. Blood, seen as the essence of life, was considered the most precious gift. Priests and rulers often practiced bloodletting, drawing their own blood as an offering. It was an act of devotion, a personal gift to the gods, binding the human and divine in a tangible way. For the ordinary person watching, these acts were both awe-inspiring and humbling. They reinforced the sense that rulers were not just political leaders but also mediators with the divine. Their ability to endure pain, to give of themselves, was seen as proof of their worthiness. But it was also a reminder of the burdens placed upon all. Survival required sacrifice, in work, in tribute, in the steady giving of life's essence to something greater. Beyond the great plazas, religion also touched the quieter rhythms of existence. Birth was marked with prayers and offerings, mothers thanking the gods for new life, while also pleading for strength to sustain it. Childhood carried its own rituals, from naming ceremonies to initiations, each reminding families that their children were part of a larger cosmic story. Marriage, too, was not simply a union of two individuals, but a binding of households, witnessed by gods and ancestors. Even death, though mourned, was not an end but a passage. The soul traveled into the underworld, guided by dogs or by gods, tested by challenges, until it emerged, transformed. The underworld itself, known as Shib, was imagined not as a place of eternal suffering, but as a realm of trials. Stories told of journeys through darkness, of rivers filled with scorpions, of houses filled with smoke or cold. To pass through was difficult, but it was also necessary, a mirror of the struggles faced in life. For the Maya, hardship was not separate from the sacred, but part of it, woven into the path that each soul must walk. As night fell across the Maya world, religion did not sleep. Priests studied the stars, charting movements, preparing for future ceremonies. Families whispered prayers by firelight, their shadows flickering against walls of stone or thatch. The gods were near, listening in silence, their presence as constant as the chirp of insects or the rustle of palm leaves in the wind. And so, through rituals grand and small, through sacrifice and prayer, through the ever-present awareness of divine order, the Maya endured. Their lives were hard, their survival never certain, but in their devotion they found meaning. The cosmos was vast, but within its rhythm they had a place carved in stone, written in stars, and carried in the steady beating of their hearts. The story of the Maya is not only one of fields and temples, of ritual and quiet labor, but also one of conflict. For while the cosmos bound their lives together, and religion offered rhythm and meaning, the reality of survival in the Maya world was also shaped by rivalry, ambition, and the clash of kingdoms. The land was dotted with city-states, each a world unto itself, with rulers, nobles, priests, warriors, and farmers. And like stars across the night sky, these cities shone brightly, but they also pulled against one another, caught in cycles of alliance and war. The jungle itself created both connection and division. Dense forests separated valleys and river plains, making travel difficult but not impossible. Footpaths wound their way through the undergrowth, linking villages with nearby towns, and towns with powerful cities. Along these paths, messengers carried information, tribute, and trade goods, but they also carried demands, warnings, and threats. To walk such routes was to feel the weight of the larger world, pressing upon every village and household. Warfare, in the Maya world, was not simply a matter of destruction, but a deeply ritual act, bound with religion and politics. Rulers claimed power not only by building temples or overseeing harvests, but also by proving themselves in battle. A ruler who could capture rivals, who could return to his people with living prisoners to display in ceremonies, demonstrated strength, both physical and spiritual. Such victories reinforced his place as mediator between humans and gods. His authority written not only in stone inscriptions, but also in the fearful respect of neighboring cities. Yet, for the ordinary people, war meant burden. When rulers decided to march against rivals, it was not only nobles and trained warriors who bore the cost. Farmers were called to carry provisions, to build roads, to haul stones, or to serve as foot soldiers. Young men left their fields, their families, and their maize, drawn into conflicts that may have begun as political disputes, but quickly became matters of survival. The march of an army was a solemn, heavy thing. Warriors painted their bodies with black and red, feathers tied to their arms, obsidian blades at their sides. They carried shields of woven fiber, strong yet light, decorated with patterns that marked their city. As they moved, the air filled with the low rhythm of drums, guiding their steps, keeping them unified as they advanced through the thick forest. The jungle itself seemed to hold its breath, the cries of birds silenced, the rustling of leaves muted, as if even nature paused to watch. For those who stayed behind, war brought tension. Women worked the fields alone, children carried heavier loads, elders worried over whether tribute would be demanded if their city lost. Life was always precarious, and war added another layer of uncertainty. Victory might bring security and prestige, but defeat could mean heavy tribute, loss of crops, or even the capture of loved ones. Cities themselves bore the marks of this cycle. Walls of stone rose around some defensive ramparts that turned open spaces into guarded fortresses. Gateways were narrow, allowing only a few to pass at a time, easy to defend in case of attack. Watchtowers overlooked the roads, their shadows stretching long at sunset, reminding all who entered that vigilance was constant. But even within those walls, life was not free of war's reach. Tribute was a constant demand. Conquered towns sent maize, cotton, cacao, and crafted goods to their overlords, burdens that pressed heavily upon those who already labored to survive. Tribute was not merely material, it was symbolic. It reminded the people of their place, of their subjugation, of the cycle of power that wound endlessly through the Maya world. And yet, war was not only destruction, it was also ceremony. Captured warriors were paraded in plazas, their presence a living testament to victory. Priests and nobles proclaimed the strength of their ruler, offering these prisoners as living symbols to the gods. The spectacle reinforced to the people that their city was protected, their place within the cosmic order secured, if only for a moment. Still, the cycle never ended. Cities rose, shone brightly, and fell. Power shifted from one dynasty to another, from one valley to the next. Inscriptions carved into stone recount long lists of battles, victories, and defeats. But behind these triumphs and losses lay countless ordinary livesmen pressed into service. Women carrying the weight of absence, children growing up in the shadow of war. Imagine, for a moment, the quiet in a village after the warriors had marched away. The field stretched out, waiting to be tended, but the men were gone. Women bent over the maize, their hands steady but their minds filled with worry. Fires burned, low in the hearths at night, their glow flickering across faces drawn with fatigue. Somewhere, in the distance, the faint sound of drums might echo through the forest, a reminder that battles were being fought, fates decided, lives altered. The brutality of Maya life was not always visible in sudden violence, but in this steady weight, the constant demands placed upon all. Every man, woman, and child lived with the knowledge that war could come, that tribute could increase, that their lives were not fully their own, but bound within the larger cycles of power. Yet, despite this, communities endured. They planted, they harvested, they gathered, and they prayed. They told stories around the fire, stories of gods and heroes, of worlds destroyed and worlds reborn. These stories gave meaning, turning hardship into part of a greater pattern. And in this, there was resilience, a quiet strength that allowed the Maya world to flourish for centuries, even amidst unending struggle. Life in the Maya world was built upon the steady labor of ordinary people, while the grand temples, glittering with jade and painted in brilliant reds and blues, rose high above the plazas. They were sustained by countless hands that never carved their names into stone. These were the farmers who bent low over their maize, the craftsmen who shaped clay into vessels, the women who tended the hearth and wove cotton into cloth, the children who learned early that survival was a family task. The backbone of Maya survival was maize. Corn was more than food. It was the very essence of life. In their creation stories, the gods fashioned humankind from maize dough, and so every meal was not only sustenance, but also a reminder of origin and purpose. To grow maize, however, was no simple task. Fields had to be cleared, often from dense forest. Men worked with stone tools, felling trees, burning brush, and turning the soil with digging sticks. It was heavy, slow work, done under a relentless sun or within the damp air of the jungle. When the rains came, farmers prayed that the fields would not flood. When the sun burned too hot, they prayed that the crops would not wither. Every stalk was fragile, every ear of corn uncertain, and yet the people returned year after year, their faith and their labor intertwined. Women, too, carried immense burdens. Before dawn, the first sound of the day was often the rhythmic grinding of maize on stone. Kneeling at the hearth, women pressed kernels against a metate, slowly transforming grain into flour. This was not a task of minutes, but of hours, repeated daily, the same steady motion passed down from mother to daughter. Once ground, the maize became tortillas, tamales, and porridge, meals that sustained families but required endless repetition to prepare. At the same time, women tended children, fetched water, and kept the fire burning. They spun cotton, wove textiles on backstrap looms, and crafted clothing decorated with intricate patterns that reflected both identity and artistry. Every thread was pulled and tightened by hand, each piece of cloth a labor measured in patience and time. Children were not spared from work. From an early age, they carried water in clay jars balanced carefully in their small hands. They learned to tend chickens, gather firewood, and assist in the fields. Play existed, of course, with simple toys fashioned from clay or wood, and ball games imitating those of their elders. Yet even in play, they absorbed the rhythms of labor, the awareness that their lives were part of a cycle larger than themselves. Craftsmen, too, worked endlessly, shaping the materials of their world into tools, vessels, and ornaments. Potters sat before spinning wheels of wood, shaping clay into bowls and jars, their hands smoothing edges, their fingers etching designs that told stories of gods, animals, and daily life. Once fired, these vessels held food, water, and offerings, becoming part of every household and every ritual. Stoneworkers carved blocks for temples and homes, their chisels of obsidian or flint striking stone hour after hour. Their craft demanded strength, precision, and patience. Each carving was a prayer in its own way, a slow inscription of devotion upon the hardest of surfaces. And then there were the traders, who carried salt, cacao, obsidian, and textiles across long distances. Walking on narrow paths beneath heavy loads, they linked distant towns and villages, ensuring that resources flowed even when local supplies failed. Their journeys took them through forests and rivers, over mountains and valleys, under a sky that burned by day and glittered by night. But despite these labors, survival was always fragile. Famine was never far. Drought could wither crops, leaving fields empty and granaries bare. When the maize harvest failed, families turned to roots, wild plants, or what little stores they had managed to keep. Hunger carried a quiet weight, one that pressed upon children first, their eyes growing hollow, their movements slower. Yet families endured, sharing what they had, waiting for the rains to return. Illness, too, stalked their lives. The jungle was alive with insects, carrying fevers that left bodies weak. Wounds from labor or battle could fester. Healing came through herbs, through the wisdom of healers who knew which leaves soothed pain, which roots reduced swelling, which resins eased breathing. Rituals accompanied medicine, prayers spoken as poultices were applied, songs sung to call upon divine aid. In this way, the line between health and faith was blurred, as every act of care was also an act of belief. The home itself reflected both comfort and burden. Houses were built from wood and thatch, their walls simple but sturdy, their roofs steep to shed rain. Inside, life unfolded around the hearth. Smoke rose through small gaps, filling the air with a scent that was both familiar and harsh on the lungs. Mats woven from reeds served as beds, laid out at night and rolled away in the morning. The space was small, shared by all, filled with warmth but also with the weight of crowded living. At night, after long days of toil, families gathered in dim firelight. Shadows flickered on the walls as elders told stories of gods and heroes. Children listened, their eyes wide, their bodies heavy with fatigue. These stories gave meaning to their struggles, weaving hardship into a larger pattern of divine will and cosmic cycles. In this way, the burdens of daily life became not merely endurance but participation in something greater. Festivals punctuated this rhythm, offering moments of relief. The sound of drums and flutes filled plazas. Dancers brought color and movement, and feasting provided rare abundance. Yet even these celebrations required labor. Women cooked for days, men hunted or fished to provide meat, and craftsmen prepared decorations. The joy of the festival was real, but it was built upon countless hours of unseen effort. Tribute added another layer of difficulty. Beyond their own needs, families were required to provide goods to their rulers. Maize, cacao, cotton, or crafted goods were collected and carried to the centers of power. For those already living close to the edge, tribute was a heavy demand. But refusal was not an option, for it was tribute that reinforced loyalty, that maintained the fragile balance between rulers and ruled. In the end, the life of ordinary Maya people was one of quiet resilience. Brutality was not always in sudden violence, but in the relentless demands of survival. It was in the endless grinding of maize, the bending of backs in the fields, the carrying of loads along narrow paths, the care of children while hunger pressed at the door. It was in the constant awareness that their labor supported not only their families, but also the splendor of temples, the power of rulers, and the rituals of priests. Yet, in their endurance, there was also beauty, in the intricate patterns of woven cloth, in the polished surfaces of painted pottery, in the laughter of children playing ball in dusty courtyards, in the songs sung softly at night. Life was hard, but it was also full of meaning, shaped by hands that created, voices that prayed, and hearts that endured. The land that the Maya called home was both a gift and a trial. Stretching across dense forests, limestone plains, and scattered mountains, it offered beauty and abundance, but also hardship. At first glance, the rainforest might seem lush and overflowing with resources, but to those who depended upon it daily, it was a place of both generosity and constant testing. The earth was thin in many regions, its soil shallow above the limestone bedrock. Fields were carved from this stubborn ground, cleared with effort, cultivated with hope. Maize, beans, and squash, the sacred trinity of crops, were coaxed from the land, but the soil quickly grew weary, depleted by repeated harvests. Farmers responded with shifting agriculture, leaving fields fallow, cutting new plots from the forest. Each new clearing was an act of survival, but also one of exhaustion, for the forest was vast, yet never endless. Water, too, was both abundant and elusive. In some areas, rivers and lakes provided steady sources, shimmering under the heat of the sun. In others, however, water lay hidden beneath the earth, stored in natural sinkholes known as These pools, dark and still, became lifelines for entire communities. To drink, to wash, to irrigate, people descended into their depths, carrying water back in jars upon their shoulders. Each drop was precious, each vessel carried carefully, for without water, no life could continue. But the climate was fickle. The Maya lived in a world where seasons alternated between rain and drought. When rains arrived on time, fields turned green, rivers swelled, and villages thrived. Yet when the rains delayed, when clouds withheld their gift, the land quickly withered. Crops failed, reservoirs dried, the ground cracked beneath the sun's heat. Hunger followed in silence, a slow ache in the belly, a heaviness in the body, a quiet fear in the heart. Great droughts came in cycles, stretching not for weeks but for years. The people watched the skies, searching for clouds that refused to gather. Priests offered prayers and rituals, hoping to draw water from the heavens. Kings promised that their power could bring relief, that the gods would listen to their words. But when the skies remained clear, doubt grew, and with it, despair. The brutality of drought was not sudden, like the strike of a storm, but gradual and unyielding. First, families ate their stored maize, carefully rationing it, stretching each handful further than the last. Then, as stores emptied, they turned to roots and wild plants, searching the forest for anything edible. Children grew thin, elders weakened. Illness, always lurking in the background, grew stronger when bodies weakened from hunger. Entire cities felt the weight of these shortages. Great plazas, once filled with festivals and trade, became quieter. Markets shrank, craftwork slowed, tribute faltered, for villages that could not feed themselves could not send goods to their rulers. Power, once displayed in grand ceremonies, became fragile when the people's stomachs were empty. The land itself seemed to resist. Where forests were cut too heavily, the soil eroded. Where fields were overworked, harvests shrank. Lakes dried, their beds cracked and empty. In some regions, great reservoirs were built to catch and store water, a brilliant achievement of engineering. yet even these could run dry in the face of unrelenting drought. The sound of footsteps upon a dusty, empty reservoir must have carried with it a haunting weight for echo of survival slipping away. The collapse of great Maya cities was not caused by a single moment of disaster, but by a slow accumulation of strain. Drought pressed hardest, but behind it was centuries of environmental pressure. Forests thinned, wildlife retreated, hunting grew harder. The demands of growing populations pushed the land to its limits. What had once sustained thousands could suddenly no longer provide. Imagine a city like Tikal, its towering temples rising high above the forest canopy. In its prime, it thrived with markets bustling, plazas echoing with music, and rulers presiding over ceremonies of grandeur. Yet when droughts lengthened, even a city so great became vulnerable. Its reservoirs, carefully maintained, could no longer provide enough. Its tribute networks, once strong, faltered as surrounding villages struggled. Without food, without water, even stone giants like Tikal could tremble. For ordinary people, the collapse was not abstract. It was felt in empty bowls, in parched lips, in fields that yielded nothing. Families abandoned homes in search of better land, leaving behind villages that slowly fell silent. Paths once busy with traders grew quiet. The jungle, patient and ever-growing, reclaimed what had been cleared. Walls tumbled, plazas filled with weeds. Temples stood lonely in the canopy. The brutality of the Maya environment was that it gave life generously, but took it away just as its rains could transform a landscape into abundance, but when absent, they revealed how fragile human existence truly was. Every season was a gamble, every harvest uncertain, every family balanced between survival and loss. And yet, the Maya adapted with resilience. They built terraces to hold soil, canals to guide water, reservoirs to store rain. They prayed and sacrificed, tying their lives to cycles of gods and cosmos. Even when drought pressed hardest, they endured for centuries, finding ways to persist in a land that tested them constantly. Their collapse, when it came, was not the end of their people, but the shifting of their lives. Cities fell silent, but villages remained. The forest closed in, but families continued to plant, harvest, pray, and survive. When one stands today before a ruined temple, its stones warm under the sun, it is easy to imagine silence, but once, that place echoed with life. It is not only the grandeur of kings or the brilliance of architecture that should be remembered, but also the quiet struggles of those who labored beneath the weight of sun and drought, who carried water from cenotes, who planted maize in weary soil, who watched the skies with both hope and fear. For in truth, the brutality of life in the Maya world was often not in the hand of rulers or the strike of war, but in the patient, unyielding pressure of the earth and sky. Nature itself was both ally and adversary, a force that shaped their daily lives, their cities, and ultimately their history. And through it all, the Maya endured, finding meaning in struggle, beauty in survival, and faith in the cycles that ruled both the heavens and the earth. To understand the Maya, one must step into the quiet rhythm of their spiritual world. For religion was not a separate sphere of life, but the very breath that moved through every act, every field, every hearth, and every skyward glance. The Maya lived within a cosmos alive with gods, spirits, ancestors, and forces that touched the smallest seed as well as the grandest temple. Each day began with reverence. At dawn, as the first light spilled through the dense canopy and painted the stone temples in soft hues of gold, families lit incense in their homes. The curling smoke drifted upward, carrying prayers to the heavens. These were not elaborate offerings, sometimes only a few kernels of maize, or a drop of honey, or the soft fragrance of copal resin burned upon glowing embers. Yet to the Maya, even the smallest gesture was a thread tying their lives to the divine order. The gods they worshipped were many, each tied to elements of the natural world. Chok, the rain god, was called upon in times of drought, his image carved with great care upon stone altars. Kinich Ahau, the sun god, was honored daily, his warm gaze both nurturing and dangerous. Ix Chel, the goddess of fertility and weaving, held sway over birth and creativity. The gods were not distant abstractions, but living presences that touched the everyday Ichmeal, each planting, each step upon the earth. The Maya believed that the world itself was a living structure, layered and complex. The earth upon which they walked was not solid and isolated, but part of a great cosmic tree, its roots reaching into the underworld, its branches stretching into the heavens. Caves, deep and dark, were thought to be portals into that underworld, places where the veil between worlds thinned. Cenotes, with their still waters, were sacred thresholds, mirrors of eternity where offerings were cast with reverence. In villages and cities alike, rituals punctuated the year. Planting festivals marked the start of the agricultural cycle, where prayers and songs accompanied the sowing of maize. Harvest celebrations followed, with dancing and feasting, gratitude woven into every gesture. These ceremonies were not merely symbolic, but essential acts that maintained the fragile balance between humanity and the divine. To plant without prayer, to harvest without thanks, would be to break the chain of order that bound heaven, earth, and underworld together. The rulers of the Maya were more than political figures. They were sacred intermediaries. Kings and queens stood as bridges between mortals and gods, their rituals ensuring the stability of the cosmos itself. When a king bled upon an altar, offering his very life's essence, it was not simply for personal devotion, but for the nourishment of the universe. The spilling of royal blood was believed to open a passage to the spirit world, allowing communication with ancestors and gods. This was not brutality for cruelty's sake, but devotion, carried to the deepest level of profound belief that sacrifice sustained all life. Ceremonies could be grand spectacles. Imagine a plaza filled with thousands, the air heavy with incense, drums echoing in steady rhythm, dancers adorned with bright feathers moving in time. The king, clothed in jade and jaguar skins, ascended the steps of a great temple. Torches flickered as night descended. The people watched in silence as he performed sacred rites, cutting his skin to release a few drops of blood onto prepared paper, which was then burned, its smoke rising like a direct message to the heavens. To those present, this was not merely symbolic, it was a literal act of sustenance, keeping the world in motion. Yet spirituality was not confined to royal plazas or monumental temples. In small homes, families marked their own sacred moments. A mother whispered a prayer as she wove cloth, believing the goddess Ixchel guided her hands. A farmer placed maize kernels carefully into the soil with ritual words, asking the gods of rain and earth to bless the crop. A healer mixed herbs in the soft glow of firelight, calling upon spirits for guidance. Every act, however ordinary, carried a touch of the divine. Death itself was not an end, but a transition within this spiritual order. The Maya believed the soul journeyed through layers of the underworld, passing trials and tests, accompanied at times by animal spirits or guided by ancestors. For those of noble status, grand burials placed them within tombs beneath temples, surrounded by offerings of jade, pottery, and food for the afterlife. For common people, simpler graves held small tokens, yet the intention was the same: to provide for the journey, to honor the soul, to acknowledge that life continued in another form. The brutality of existence, the hunger, the drought, the toil was softened by this web of belief. To suffer was not meaningless. It was part of a cosmic cycle. Hardship was not abandonment, but a test, a balance between humans and gods. The rain might withhold, but prayers could bring it back. The earth might resist, but offerings could soften its heart. The world was not cruel by chance. It was alive, demanding respect, requiring reciprocity. Great stories told of the hero twins, mythic figures who descended into the underworld to outwit the lords of death, proving that cleverness and courage could triumph even against despair. Such tales, repeated around fires and in plazas, reassured listeners that even in the face of hardship, there was resilience, there was hope, there was meaning. The calendar, too, tied daily life to the cosmic rhythm. The Maya tracked time with extraordinary precision, each day holding a sacred quality. Births, marriages, planting, journeys, all were timed to harmonize with the cycles of the sun, moon, and stars. To live without heed to this calendar would have been unthinkable. It was not merely a way to measure time, but a way to align human life with the great order of the universe. Night brought its own rituals. As stars pierced the darkness, families looked upward, tracing patterns familiar for generations. The Milky Way stretched across the sky, imagined as a celestial river or the body of a great serpent. Venus shone brightly, a powerful sign linked to both war and renewal. The heavens were not silent, they spoke constantly, and the Maya listened with devotion. Through all of this, religion was not a burden but a balm. It gave structure to fear, purpose to suffering, and dignity to the endless toil of survival. To rise before dawn and light incense was to affirm that life was connected to something larger. To plant maize with prayer was to believe that the gods cared, that the harvest was not random but sacred. To endure hunger with offerings was to trust that cycles would turn, that rain would come, that the gods, in their own time, would restore balance. In this way, even the brutality of Maya life was softened by the certainty of faith. For the people, every drop of sweat, every whispered prayer, every ritual act bound them not only to their community, but to the entire living universe. Their world was alive, and in their devotion, they found the strength to endure. Life among the ancient Maya, for all its beauty and grandeur, was woven through with quiet burdens that pressed heavily upon each family. To understand why life felt so brutal at times, it helps to imagine not only the towering pyramids and elaborate rituals but also the smaller, humbler rhythms of daily existence, things that shaped every morning, every task, and every hope. A Maya village, at first glance, might have appeared serene. Thatched houses with walls of wattle and daub were arranged around courtyards, their doorways opening to the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Smoke drifted lazily from hearth fires, mingling with the scent of maize porridge cooking in clay pots. Children laughed, chasing one another barefoot through the dust, their giggles momentarily lifting the heaviness of life. It all seemed simple, even peaceful, but beneath that stillness lay endless labor. From the earliest hours of the morning until well after the sun had set, family members each carried responsibilities that could not be escaped. For men, the day often began in the fields. With stone tools and simple wooden implements, they worked the earth tirelessly, coaxing maize, beans, and squash from the soil. In good years, the crop sprouted strong, filling storage pits and baskets. In bad years, drought or pests brought scarcity, and every swing of the AOA was weighted with anxiety about whether the family would endure the coming season. Women bore equal, if not heavier, burdens. From dawn, they tended to the hearth, grinding maize kernels into flour with a matate stone, a task that consumed hours and strained the body. The sound of grinding stone against stone, steady and rhythmic, was the backdrop of Maya life, repeated endlessly, generation after generation. Once the flour was prepared, tortillas were shaped by hand, or atole, a thin maize drink, was simmered for meals. Alongside this, women wove cloth, cared for children, fetched water, and often assisted in the fields as well. Their labor was constant, unseen, but utterly essential. Children, too, were not free from obligation. From an early age, boys learned to assist in farming or crafting, while girls were taught the skills of grinding, cooking, and weaving. Play was not absent. Children's laughter and small games filled village courtyards, but it was always balanced with duty. Each child's work prepared them for the adult responsibilities that would arrive swiftly, sometimes sooner than expected. The division of roles was clear, but it was not rigidly cruel. Rather, it reflected a social order where survival demanded that everyone contribute. Still, the weight was heavy. A day of missed work could mean less food, fewer goods to trade, or unplanted crops. To be idle was almost unthinkable. Marriage was central to Maya society. Young people were often matched by their families, unions arranged with careful attention to kinship and community ties. A wedding was a communal event, marked by ritual prayers, shared meals, and offerings to the gods. Yet beyond the celebration, marriage quickly turned into a life of work. A young bride might move into her husband's household, where expectations were immediate, tending to his family's hearth, weaving, bearing children, and supporting the extended kin. A groom, likewise, bore the pressure of proving himself in the fields or workshops, demonstrating that he could sustain his family through skill and persistence. Children were valued deeply, for they carried forward both lineage and labor. Yet childbearing brought its own risks. Without advanced medicine, childbirth was fraught with danger. Mothers often endured long hours of pain, supported by midwives who whispered prayers to the goddess Ixchel. Sometimes, the child arrived safely, its cries welcomed with relief and joy. Other times, tragedy shadowed the household, and both mother and child were lost. Such sorrows were not rare, and each family bore scars from them. Illness was another shadow upon Maya households. With limited remedies, fevers, infections, or injuries could turn swiftly toward death. Healers used herbs, chants, and rituals to ease suffering, and sometimes their care worked wonders. Other times, families watched helplessly as sickness spread, unable to stop it. The fragility of health was a constant reminder of life's precariousness. For artisans and specialists, life brought both pride and burden. A skilled potter, weaver, or scribe held a respected place, their work admired for beauty and function alike. Yet specialization did not free them from toil, it deepened it. Hours upon hours were poured into carving intricate glyphs, painting vibrant murals, or shaping clay into vessels. The work demanded focus and dedication, often under the expectation of serving noble patrons. Beauty came from labor, and labor came with strain. Even within towns and cities, where life seemed more dynamic, hardships lingered. The bustling markets of great Maya centers were filled with chatter, barter, and color. Vendors displayed woven cloth, painted pottery, cacao beans, salt, and jade. Shoppers mingled, exchanging goods with lively voices. Yet behind the vibrancy lay unspoken truth. Every item represented long hours of work, often under scorching sun or in dim workshops. Wealth was unevenly distributed, and while some families could afford luxuries, others struggled to provide even the basics. Hierarchy also shaped daily struggles. At the top, nobles lived with relative comfort, their homes larger, their clothing adorned with fine jade, feathers, and embroidered designs. They directed labor, collected tribute, and presided over rituals. Yet even their lives were not free from anxiety. Nobles were responsible for sustaining the gods through ceremonies, for defending their people in war, and for ensuring prosperity. Failure weighed heavily, and their status demanded constant vigilance. At the bottom of the social order were laborers and captives. Laborers toiled in fields or worked on monumental projects, hauling stone blocks, constructing temples, or maintaining irrigation systems. The work was unending, bodies bent to the will of kings and gods alike. Captives, taken in wars, faced uncertain fates, sometimes integrated into society as workers, other times held for ritual purposes. Their presence was a reminder of the fragility of freedom. In family life, joy and sorrow were interwoven. Festivities brought moments of laughter and relief. Weddings, births, harvest celebrations, all were marked with dancing, feasting, and music. Flutes, drums, and rattles filled the air, echoing through plazas and courtyards. Children played freely, chasing each other under the watch of elders. Stories were told by firelight, weaving humor and wisdom into long nights. Such moments carried warmth, yet they always existed against the backdrop of struggle. Brutality, then, was not always a matter of violence or cruelty, was the steady weight of endless responsibility, the ever-present possibility of loss, the knowledge that survival required unceasing effort. The Maya endured not because life was gentle, but because resilience was ingrained in every task, every relationship, every prayer. At night, when the fires dimmed and families gathered to rest, the quiet was filled with reflections of the day. A father thought of the fields he must tend tomorrow. A mother worried about the next meal, grinding stones awaiting her at dawn. Children drifted to sleep, dreams mingling with the faint sounds of insects and distant drums. The stars glowed, above, serene and eternal, while below, human lives pressed onward, bound by cycles of work and devotion. In this way, the brutality of Maya life was not always sharp or sudden, but steady, persistent, and unavoidable. Yet within that weight lay meaning, for every struggle was tied to family, to community, and to the gods themselves. To endure was to fulfill one's role in a world alive with both hardship and holiness. The Maya world, for all its beauty and devotion, was never free from the looming presence of conflict. Life carried on in quiet villages and bustling marketplaces, but over the horizon, tensions often brewed between rival cities, rival lords, and rival dynasties. Warfare among the Maya was not constant, yet it was frequent enough that its shadow lay across the land like a lingering storm. For the people, this too was part of the harshness of existence, another layer of uncertainty added to already difficult lives. To imagine this, one might first think of the great city-states of the Maya, rising proudly from the jungles of Mesoamerica. Towering pyramids pierced the canopy, plazas spread wide beneath open skies, and palaces echoed with the voices of rulers and scribes. Yet each city was not merely a community, it was a kingdom, independent and ambitious, governed by rulers who sought to expand their influence, secure resources, and affirmed their power in the eyes of both their people and their gods. These ambitions naturally led to rivalry. Borders were not fixed, and alliances shifted like the winds. A city that was a trusted partner one decade might become an enemy the next. Tribute, trade, and pride were all at stake. The jungles and valleys between cities often bore witness to marches of warriors, the distant sounds of drums and conch shells announcing the presence of armies. For ordinary families, the thought of conflict brought fear of raids, of crops trampled, of loved ones taken captive. Maya warfare differed from the great sweeping battles of later ages. Theirs was often more personal, more intimate. Armies were not vast legions but smaller groups of skilled warriors, each trained in the arts of combat with spears, obsidian blades, and wooden clubs edged with sharp stone. Painted in vivid colors, adorned with feathers and headdresses, warriors carried with them not only weapons but also symbols of their lineage and honor. To fight was not only to defend territory, but to embody the pride of one's ancestors. For the ruling class, captives were of particular importance. Unlike wars fought simply for conquest, Maya conflicts often focused on taking prisoners, who were then brought back to cities as offerings to the gods or as tokens of triumph. The capture of a rival noble was celebrated with ceremony, his presence proof of the victor's strength and divine favor. To ordinary people, this aspect of warfare carried both dread and meaning. It was dreadful because it could mean the loss of loved ones, torn from families and homes. Yet it also affirmed the cosmic balance. 4 captives were seen as part of the necessary offerings to sustain the gods. Within cities, the news of warfare brought tension. Families whispered about which allies might turn, which enemies might attack, and whether their own lords could protect them. The thought of raiders slipping into farmland, burning stores of maize, or carrying off children struck fear into households. Even when conflict did not directly touch a village, its echoes could be felt. Increased tribute demanded to fund campaigns, heavier workloads to build fortifications, or sons conscripted to march with their lords. To the common farmer, the brutality of warfare was not always the clash of weapons, but the ripple effect upon his daily life. A season's harvest might be seized to support the army, leaving little for the family's table. A brother or son might not return, claimed not by battle but by the exhaustion of marching long distances, sleeping under open skies, and enduring the hunger that came with supply shortages. Yet warfare was not without pageantry, and this pageantry carried its own weight. Victories were celebrated with processions and feasts. The captured paraded before the people, the rulers displaying their triumph with elaborate rituals. Such spectacles reminded everyone of the fragility of life, for the fate of the captured might be grim. Yet it also reminded them of the gods' favor toward their own city. To witness such events was to feel pride in one's people, even as it brought sorrow for those on the losing side. For the warriors themselves, life was a mixture of honor and hardship. Training began young, with boys learning to throw spears, wield clubs, and move silently through forests. Courage was admired, but the physical toll was heavy. Marching barefoot across uneven ground, carrying heavy gear, enduring heat, thirst, and fear, it all pressed upon the body. Victories brought honor, but defeat could mean humiliation or death. To live as a warrior was to carry both pride and constant risk. Women, too, felt the weight of war. While they did not march with armies, they bore the absence of husbands, brothers, and sons. They kept homes together, sustained fields, and worried endlessly for the return of loved ones. They also endured the anguish of loss, whether of kin taken captive, or of harvests destroyed by passing armies. Their burdens were quieter but no less heavy, a reminder that the pain of war extended beyond the battlefield. In times of peace, the scars of warfare still lingered. Ruins of burned villages stood as reminders, stories of raids passed from generation to generation. Families remembered ancestors who had vanished, their names spoken with sorrow around fires. The brutality of war was not just in the moment of conflict, but in the memory that remained, shaping how people viewed their neighbors and their gods. Even within the grandeur of Maya cities, warfare intruded. Nobles plotted alliances, rulers worried over rival kings, and scribes carved glyphs recording battles and triumphs. Murals depicted warriors with captives, glorifying the victories of rulers, while reminding all of the cost. To walk through a plaza and see such images was to know that warfare was part of life's rhythm, as inseparable as planting or prayer. It is important to note, too, that warfare was not constant. Between conflicts, peace brought rebuilding, trade, and renewal. Yet the uncertainty of when conflict might return meant that peace was never entirely restful. The shadow of possible raids, shifting alliances, and the ambitions of neighboring rulers always loomed. This uncertainty itself was a form of brutality, an ever-present unease that kept families from feeling fully secured at night. As families gathered by firelight, they sometimes spoke of battles both near and distant. Elders recounted tales of courage and survival, of warriors who had defended the city with honor. Yet beneath these stories lay quiet prayers, that their own children might not be taken, that their fields might not be trampled, that their homes might not be consumed by fire. The brutality of Maya warfare was not measured only in bloodshed, but in fear, in loss, in the unrelenting pressure it placed upon daily existence. For ordinary families, it was another reminder that life was fragile, that survival demanded resilience not only against hunger and drought, but also against the ambitions of men and gods. And yet, as always, the Maya endured. They tilled fields, wove cloth, raised children, and prayed to the gods, finding strength in cycles that outlasted even the fiercest wars. Their world was never free from conflict, but neither was it free from the quiet determination of people who carried on, even when the drums of war echoed in the distance. The Maya cities rose like islands of stone and order within seas of thick jungle. From afar, their pyramids towered above treetops, their plazas gleamed under the sun, and their palaces stretched proudly across carefully leveled ground. To the traveler approaching one of these urban centers, the first impression would have been one of majesty. Yet within this grandeur lay difficulties, for life in the heart of a Maya city was not always easier than life in the villages that surrounded it. The pulse of a city was its people: nobles, scribes, priests, artisans, merchants, farmers, and laborers. Each group contributed to the hum of daily life. Plazas filled with voices, footsteps, and the sound of market stalls opening at dawn. The smell of ground maize, roasting cacao, and fresh-cut wood mingled in the air, but with density came strain. Families lived close together, houses packed more tightly than in the countryside, and this closeness carried both warmth and tension. Crowded streets meant noise, and noise was constant. Children's laughter echoed alongside the calls of sellers. Drums and flutes marked ceremonies. Messengers rushed through narrow pathways with news from one quarter to another. For those who longed for quiet, it was not easy to find. Life in a Maya city rarely allowed for true silence. Water was among the greatest challenges of urban life. Many Maya cities were built in places where natural rivers were scarce, and so reservoirs, canals, and cisterns became essential. These water systems were marvels of engineering, carved and shaped with care, lined with plaster to hold the precious liquid. Yet even with ingenuity, water could be scarce in dry seasons. In times of drought, entire populations strained to share what little remained, the tension rising as supplies dwindled. Food to carried pressures. In the countryside, families tended their own milpas, planting maize, beans, and squash in shifting cycles. In the city, many relied on supplies brought in from surrounding farmland. This meant that harvests far beyond the walls had to be plentiful enough to sustain not only villages but also rulers, nobles, priests, and the swelling urban population. A single poor harvest could ripple outward, leaving markets thin, prices high, and families hungry. At the heart of urban life was the demand for labor. The grandeur of temples and palaces was built not by chance but by countless hands. Men carried stone, cut timber, and hauled water. Women wove textiles, prepared food, and raised children while also supporting construction efforts through grinding maize to feed workers. Every monument, every stairway, every carved lintel represented the work of thousands who gave their strength to raise the vision of their rulers. For ordinary people, this was a heavy burden, a demand that often took them from their fields and homes. Markets were lively places of exchange, yet they too reflected the weight of necessity. Farmers brought their goods to trade: cow beans, maize, peppers, and honey. Artisans displayed finely made pottery, carved jade and obsidian blades. The marketplace was a center of color and sound, but it was also a place of constant negotiation. A family might trade food for tools, tools for cloth, cloth for a handful of cacao. The richness of trade was undeniable, yet beneath it lay the quiet worry of whether one had enough to exchange, enough to bring home, enough to last until the next season. Hygiene, too, presented difficulties. With so many people gathered in one place, waste accumulated quickly. Systems existed to manage it, but in the heat of the tropics, odors lingered and sickness could spread. A crowded city meant not only opportunities but also greater risk of illness, and when disease did sweep through, it could touch households swiftly and without mercy. Ceremonies and rituals filled urban calendars, binding communities together in shared observance. Plazas thrummed with music, chanting, and dancing, the air alive with incense smoke. To witness such events was to feel connected to something vast, to see one's rulers stand as intermediaries between people and gods. Yet these occasions also highlighted the divisions of society. Nobles appeared in splendid attire, draped in feathers and jade, while ordinary people crowded at the edges, watching from afar. The contrast reminded everyone of their place in the order, of the distance between those who commanded and those who served. For the common person, daily life in a city was a balance between resilience and exhaustion. Rising before dawn, grinding maize by hand for hours, walking long distances to fetch water, carrying loads of firewood, these tasks consumed much of the day before any additional duties for rulers or markets were fulfilled. Rest was brief, and yet people found ways to endure, weaving moments of joy into the rhythm. Children playing in courtyards, friends sharing laughter in the shade, families gathering to tell stories by firelight. Environmental pressures amplified the strains of city living. The Maya environment was demanding, with heavy rains, intense heat, and unpredictable droughts. Cities depended on the land beyond their borders, and when that land faltered, so too did the urban heart. Soil exhaustion from continuous farming meant that new land had to be cleared, sometimes farther and farther away, increasing the burden on those who transported food into the city. A long drought could dry reservoirs, wilt crops, and bring hunger to thousands, turning the majesty of stone plazas into arenas of quiet desperation. The grandeur of the cities themselves, while inspiring, also demanded constant upkeep. Temples had to be maintained, walls repaired, causeways cleared of encroaching vegetation. This meant more labor, more tribute, more demands on those who already carried the heaviest loads. For commoners, the splendor of towering pyramids was often seen from below, their necks craned upward, knowing their own sweat had built them, yet feeling distant from the glory they symbolized. Amid all of this, hope still glimmered in small, personal ways. A mother's lullaby at night, a father teaching a child to plant maize, neighbors helping one another during lean times. These were the quiet victories of urban living, the ways in which people softened the weight of daily burdens. In the shadows of temples, life carried on with resilience, ordinary moments shining like small lanterns in the vastness of time. For the Maya, city life was a paradox. It was filled with splendor yet laced with struggle. It offered opportunities for trade, learning, and shared rituals, but it also magnified the hardships of survival. Crowding, hunger, labor, and environmental strain pressed constantly on the people who lived within its walls. Yet, despite the difficulties, cities endured for centuries, standing as testaments to both the brilliance and the brutality of Maya civilization. At night, when torches flickered across plazas and the stars emerged above the jungle canopy, the city seemed almost eternal. Yet within its homes, families whispered their prayers, as they always had, for rain, for food, for health, for peace. In this way, life in the Maya city was much like life anywhere else in their world, a constant negotiation between hardship and endurance, between the weight of daily demands and the hope for a gentler tomorrow. The grandeur of Maya civilization, with its shining cities and towering temples, was never fixed in time. Like the slow shifting of the stars, the life of these communities carried cycles of growth and decline. For centuries, the Maya had balanced on a delicate edge, their achievements built upon systems that required constant care and cooperation. Yet eventually, that balance began to waver. In the centuries we now look back upon as the classic Maya period, cities rose with astonishing ambition, palaces were enlarged, plazas expanded, and pyramids climbed higher into the sky. Rulers sought to outshine one another, each generation hoping to leave behind monuments more impressive than the last. The very scale of their vision became a burden, for greater buildings demanded greater labor, and greater labor meant heavier demands placed upon the people who supported the city. At first, the burden could be managed. Families contributed time, food, and energy, proud to see their efforts reflected in temples and altars. But as years passed, the demands did not lessen, they grew, and with them grew the quiet strain on farmers who spent longer away from their own fields, on women who carried more weight in tending households, on children who found themselves working earlier in life. Splendor, so dazzling to behold, was purchased at the cost of ordinary endurance. The land itself bore signs of exhaustion. For centuries, fields had been cleared, burned, and planted with maize, beans, and squash. This system, known as shifting cultivation, worked well when population was smaller and land abundant. But with cities swelling, more and more fields had to be opened, often in less fertile soil. Farmers pressed deeper into forests, clearing farther from home, carrying their harvests longer distances. Soil that once yielded generously began to give less. The earth tired from overuse. Rain, too, became uncertain. The Maya world was bound to the cycle of wet and dry seasons, and when rains came late or not at all, the consequences were felt immediately. Reservoirs that once brimmed with water dropped low. Wells revealed their stony bottoms. Crops withered under the sun, and hunger grew sharper in households already strained by tribute demands. In some periods, evidence suggests droughts stretched not just for 1 or 2 seasons, but across decades, a relentless test of human resilience. That as environmental pressures mounted, political pressures did too. Cities that had long competed with one another for power and prestige became locked in cycles of rivalry. Kings sought to prove their might, not only with temples, but also with war. Armies marched along causeways, banners fluttering, weapons gleaming in the sun. For nobles, victories meant honor and prestige. For common people, wars meant loss, fields abandoned, food taken, and families displaced. Warfare in the Maya world was rarely a matter of conquest for new land alone. It was often about prestige, captives, and the reaffirmation of divine right. Yet for those caught in its path, the reasons mattered little. What mattered was survival. The march of soldiers could mean a village emptied, its people scattered, its crops trampled. Even those who lived far from battlefields felt the tremors of conflict through higher demands for tribute, food, and labor to sustain rulers' ambitions. Inside cities, unrest grew slowly, quietly, like a fire smoldering beneath ash. Ordinary families carried the weight of famine, disease, and conscription. Nobles continued their ceremonies, the incense smoke curling upward as prayers for rain and victory filled the air. But for the weary farmer or artisan, faith in the old order began to wane. What good were the offerings if the rains did not come? What good were monuments if the people could not eat? The collapse, when it unfolded, was not a single moment of sudden destruction. It was a long unraveling, stretched across generations. City by city, population declined. Plazas once filled with voices grew quieter. Markets thinned. Temples no longer gleamed with fresh plaster. The proud inscriptions of rulers stopped being carved. Slowly, the great cities that had defined Maya life emptied, their stone walls left to the jungle that pressed endlessly against them. For those who lived through this unraveling, the experience must have been disorienting. Imagine a family walking through a plaza where once music and chanting had filled the air, now hearing only the calls of birds nesting in abandoned roof beams. Imagine the silence of a market stall where no goods are laid out, where once the bustle of trade had meant food for the evening meal. Imagine a child staring at a temple no longer climbed by priests, wondering why the gods had turned away. Yet even in collapse, life did not end. Families adapted, as people always do. Many left the great cities behind, returning to smaller villages, 2 farms tucked into the forest. There, life was humbler, quieter, but also perhaps steadier. Freed from the crushing demands of monumental building and endless tribute, people relied again on closekin and the rhythm of planting and harvesting. Still, hardship did not vanish. The land remained challenging, rains uncertain, and the memory of cities lingered like a shadow. To those who had once contributed to grand monuments, the contrast must have been striking. Stone pyramids abandoned, while new generations lived in modest homes of wood and thatch. Yet in these smaller communities, resilience endured. Life pressed on in new forms, shaped not by towering kings, but by the humble cycles of family, field, and faith. From the perspective of history, the collapse of Maya cities is often spoken of in dramatic terms. Yet from within, it was likely experienced as a gradual shift, a steady tightening of hardship until the splendor no longer could be sustained. For the ordinary person, it meant fewer feasts, less certainty, more hunger, and the quiet sorrow of watching once proud places wither, and in the end, the jungle reclaimed what people had built. Vines crept over walls, trees grew through courtyards, roots split stone stairways that had once carried kings. The voices of the Maya did not vanish, they continued in villages, in rituals, in languages still spoken today. But the great cities became hushed, their plazas echoing only with the wind, their temples standing as reminders of what had been to lie beneath the night sky in those final years. Hearing the cries of distant animals where once music had played must have been a haunting experience. The stars still turned in their ancient patterns, silent and steady, while on earth the great order of cities fell apart. For those who endured, hope was perhaps placed not in monuments or kings, but in the simple resilience of planting another field, telling another story, teaching another child. The collapse was not the end of the Maya, but it was the end of an age. It revealed, perhaps more clearly than anything else, how fragile greatness can be, and how the weight of splendor can become a burden too heavy to carry. Yet even as cities faded, the spirit of endurance remained, carried in small communities, in whispered prayers, in the quiet rhythm of survival. Even as the great stone cities slipped into silence, the story of the Maya did not end. The jungle pressed in, vines wrapping themselves around pillars, roots lifting the edges of carved steps, birds built nests in empty temples, and the sound of howler monkeys echoed where once the voices of priests and kings had carried prayers. To the outsider, it may have seemed as though the Maya world had vanished, but this was never truly so. Life continued different, smaller in scale, but no less meaningful for those who lived it. Families, who had once been tied to the grandeur of palaces and plazas, returned to the more intimate rhythm of village life. Thatched homes clustered together, smoke rising gently from hearth fires in the cool mornings. Fields were planted again, though not to sustain vast cities, but to feed households and neighbors. Maize sprouted in neat rows, beans wound their way up stalks, and squash spread broad leaves across the soil. These were humble scenes, yet they carried the essence of survival. The quiet assurance that even in change, life endured. The people still told stories, passing down myths of creation and cycles of time. Children listened with wide eyes as elders spoke of gods who shaped the world from maize dough, of journeys through the underworld, of heroes who outwitted darkness. These tales did not require pyramids to be true. They required only the gathering of family around the warmth of a fire. In whispered words, the wisdom of generations lived on, binding past to present. Markets, though smaller, still brought color and sound to village life. Women set out baskets of peppers and herbs, honey in gourds, and bundles of fresh firewood. Men traded obsidian tools or woven mats. The clink of cacao beans, used as currency, still marked exchanges, though simpler than the sprawling markets of once great cities. These gatherings provided connection, a sense of community, and the reassurance that one was not alone in enduring the challenges of life. The environment, with its challenges of drought and abundance, continued to shape every decision. Families still watched the skies anxiously for signs of rain, still prayed for water to fill their jars and reservoirs, still felt relief when the first storms broke across the horizon. Droughts remained harsh, yet without the burden of supporting immense cities, small villages could adapt more flexibly. They shifted fields, leaned on neighbors, and found ways to share the weight of hardship. Time flowed on, measured not by monuments, but by cycles of planting, harvest, and renewal. In the absence of towering kings, leadership became humbler elders, guiding with experience. Local leaders balancing needs, families making decisions together. Life slowed, became less consumed by the grandeur of monuments, and more attuned to the gentle, repeating patterns of survival. And yet, even as the old cities slept beneath vines and soil, the Maya world retained its quiet dignity. Languages continued to be spoken, weaving threads of continuity across centuries. Rituals adapted, but the essence of reverence for nature, the cosmos, and ancestors remained. Children grew, learned to shape tools, weave cloth, and tend fields, carrying forward traditions that stretched back countless generations. To imagine these scenes is to see resilience in its purest form. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter to grind maize on a stone metate, the rhythmic sound marking another day of nourishment. A father showing his son how to plant maize seeds with care, each one a small hope for the season ahead. Neighbors gathering to repair a roof after a storm. their laughter mingling with the sound of hammering wood. These were not the scenes of kings or palaces, but they were the heart of Maya, life after collapse. The ruins of great cities became part of the landscape, familiar yet mysterious. Children might climb over fallen stones in play, their parents reminding them with hushed voices of the ancestors who once lived there. To live near such ruins was to carry a sense of both pride and caution. Pride in the greatness of the past, caution in remembering the weight of ambition that had pressed too heavily on the people. In time, the memory of kings and nobles softened, while the endurance of families remained. The true legacy of the Maya was not the crumbling temples or the silent plazas, but the persistence of ordinary people who carried on through droughts, through hunger, through uncertainty, holding fast to the simple acts of planting, cooking, storytelling, and caring. As centuries passed, the world shifted around them. New arrivals came, new powers rose, and yet the Maya people endured. Their lives changed, but their languages, beliefs, and traditions carried through, rooted as deeply as the ceiba trees that marked their landscapes. Even today, descendants of the Maya continue to live in the same regions, carrying forward threads of resilience that stretch back to those ancient days. And so, when we speak of the brutality of life for the Maya, we must remember it was not brutality alone. Yes, there was hunger, labor, drought, and loss. Yes, life demanded much from them, pressing upon body and spirit alike. But there was also endurance, creativity, and a quiet strength that allowed them to survive long after their cities fell silent. Perhaps this is the gentlest truth we can draw from their story, that greatness does not always rest in monuments or kings, but in the persistence of families who find ways to keep going, day after day, season after season, even in the face of hardship. So, as you rest now, imagine the quiet of an ancient Maya village at night. The stars stretch endlessly above, the same stars their astronomers once studied, the same constellations their storytellers once described. A breeze stirs the leaves, carrying the soft crackle of a distant fire. Somewhere, a mother hums a lullaby to her child, her voice gentle, her words timeless. The world is vast, but in that moment, all is calm. Let your breathing match the slow rhythm of this imagined scene. Let the weight of history settle softly around you, not as burden, but as a reminder of human endurance across time. The story of the Maya, with all its splendor and hardship, still whispers through the jungles, still lingers in the languages spoken today, still rests in the resilience of people who lived, loved, and carried on. And now, as the ruins sleep beneath vines and the stars wheel slowly above, may you too drift into rest, knowing that even in the most difficult times, life finds a way to endure.